When a freshman congresswoman from Texas walked into that hearing room, no one expected her to dismantle the Chief Justice of the United States with his own words. But by the time she sat down, the internet would never forget her name. The shy moment Chief Justice John Roberts smirked at her. The room held its breath, because Jasmine Crockett wasn't just another politician asking polite questions. She was holding a stack of papers that would turn the hearing into a reckoning. When Jasmine Crockett, the young and bold congresswoman from Texas, stepped into the Dirksen Senate office building, she knew nothing would be ordinary. The air in the room was thick with tension, the kind that always accompanies power, subtle yet undeniable. Camera lenses pointed at the faces of Washington's elite, waiting to capture every word, every gesture, every slight shift in posture. This was supposed to be just another forgettable hearing on judicial ethics, a session where the people in charge would parrot their rehearsed lines, and everyone would go home with their dignity intact. The audience would leave with nothing but the faint scent of stale coffee and the soft echo of procedural politeness. But Jasmine knew this wasn't going to be that kind of day. She wasn't loud. She didn't need to be. Her presence was enough. Dressed in a sharp navy blue suit, she stood with quiet confidence, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what you're capable of and what you've come to do. She wasn't just there to ask questions. She was there to demand answers. The chairman called her name. She stood taller, her gaze unwavering as she prepared to shake the foundations of the room with one simple question. "Chief Justice Roberts," she said, her voice calm but sharp, slicing through the stuffy atmosphere. "Can you explain why the Supreme Court refuses to adopt a binding code of ethics when your own past rulings emphasize transparency as the bedrock of public trust?" Her words hung in the air like a challenge, not just to Roberts, but to everyone in that room who had grown comfortable with the idea that the judiciary operated above reproach. Jasmine's eyes locked with Roberts's, and for a brief moment, it was clear that the game had changed. Roberts, a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of avoiding scrutiny, barely looked up from his papers. His answer was a masterclass in condescension. "Congresswoman, I assure you, the judiciary takes its ethical obligations seriously, perhaps more seriously than those who lack first-hand understanding of its complexities." The room chuckled, some dismissively, others with barely veiled amusement. The message was clear. Know your place. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She stood tall, unshaken by the subtle mockery, as if she'd expected it. The sting of condescension wasn't new to her. It wasn't the first time she'd been underestimated, and it wouldn't be the last. Instead of responding in kind, she reached for a single sheet of paper from her stack, marked with bold red ink. The silence in the room deepened as she let the moment stretch, watching Roberts, waiting for his reaction. "In your 2014 dissent in Lex Vulva Chambly," she said, her voice calm but cutting through the tension, "you wrote that the appearance of impropriety is just as damaging as impropriety itself. So, Chief Justice, how do you square that with justices vacationing on yachts owned by litigants with pending cases?" The room went still. Not a single person dared breathe. For the first time in years, the man who had ruled the nation's highest court, the man who had deflected scrutiny with the ease of a seasoned politician, looked uncomfortable. His fingers froze mid-page turn. And in that brief, haunting silence, Jasmine knew she had hit the mark. What happened next wasn't a shouting match. It wasn't some grandstanding speech, nor was it a viral meltdown. No, this was different. This was quieter, deadlier. A surgical dismantling of power, using its own weapons. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just challenging Roberts. She was using his own words, his own logic, to expose the cracks in the system he'd spent decades building and protecting. As the silence lingered in the room, Jasmine felt the weight of her actions. She knew that every word she spoke carried the weight of truth, and the moment had finally come to use that truth to its fullest extent. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't shout. She simply spoke, her tone steady, her eyes unwavering. She continued to pull from her carefully prepared files, quotes, rulings, speeches, even private emails. Each piece of evidence was like a brick in a wall that Roberts couldn't climb, a damning reflection of the system he represented. The more he tried to deflect, the harder it became for him to hide. When Roberts attempted to brush her off with a patronizing, "This hearing isn't the venue for hypotheticals," Jasmine didn't flinch. Her response was cold and precise. "Then where is the venue, Chief Justice? Because the American people deserve answers, and silence isn't good enough anymore." She held up a document, an email chain between a Supreme Court justice's spouse and a billionaire with active cases before the court. The room was on edge now. No one had anticipated this. No one had expected a freshman congresswoman from Texas to do more than ask softball questions, more than participate in the same tired dance. But Jasmine wasn't playing the game. She was rewriting the rules, and everyone in that room could feel the shift. The faces around her changed. Senators, once confident in their alignment with the status quo, lowered their phones. Reporters, who had walked into the room with pre-written narratives, stopped typing, their attention completely consumed by the unfolding spectacle. By now, even the slightest twitch of Roberts's jaw was noticeable. His usual stoic mask was cracking, piece by piece, under the weight of questions he wasn't prepared to answer. His aide leaned in close, whispering something in his ear, perhaps advice, perhaps panic. Either way, it was clear Roberts had underestimated this young woman. Jasmine wasn't finished. She knew she had him. She knew she had reached the point where the next question would break him, where his carefully constructed facade would come crashing down. Her final question hung in the air like a guillotine. "Can you name one action this court has taken in the last 5 years to restore public trust, or has it all been damage control?" For the first time that day, Roberts had no answer, just silence. And in that silence, Jasmine knew she had won. The room, once full of smug self-assurance, now seemed uncertain, uncomfortable. What had started as a routine hearing had turned into a reckoning, and Jasmine Crockett had just delivered the most significant blow. The moment Jasmine's final question echoed through the room, time seemed to slow. There was no applause, no standing ovation, only the heavy weight of truth filling the air. Chief Justice Roberts, usually so poised and unflappable, stood frozen. His eyes flickered, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any words he could have mustered. For a fleeting second, Jasmine felt a rush of satisfaction. She had done it. She had taken down one of the most powerful men in the country, using nothing but his own words, his own hypocrisy. But the feeling was fleeting, quickly replaced by the weight of what had just transpired. Jasmine wasn't in this for personal glory. She wasn't interested in basking in the aftermath of this moment. She was here because she had a job to do, a responsibility to the American people to call out corruption, hypocrisy, and abuses of power. This hearing wasn't just about Chief Justice Roberts. It was about the system that had allowed men like him to operate with impunity for far too long. As the cameras flashed and reporters began to swarm, Jasmine took a deep breath, feeling the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The battle wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. Roberts stood there, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, as if trying to regain some semblance of control over the situation. His aides murmured quietly, clearly trying to assess the damage. The room buzzed with tension, the atmosphere thick with disbelief. Jasmine's eyes never left Roberts. She could feel the weight of the room on her, but she didn't let it break her focus. This wasn't just a political showdown. This was a moral reckoning. She had called out the highest court in the land for its failures, its secrecy, its arrogance, and now she had to make sure that accountability would follow. She turned toward the rest of the room, her voice cutting through the whispers like a knife. "We are entrusted with the power to hold the powerful accountable," she said. "It's not just about the questions we ask, it's about the answers we demand." The room fell silent. For the first time that day, everyone was paying attention. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a congresswoman from Texas. She was a force to be reckoned with. The hearing room was still buzzing as the cameras captured every detail, every subtle shift in Roberts's posture. But Jasmine knew better than to get distracted by the spectacle. The moment had passed, but the real work had only just begun. The clip of her takedown would spread like wildfire, but that wouldn't be enough. She couldn't let this be a one-time event, a fleeting victory. She had to make sure it had lasting impact. Days later, as the footage continued to circulate, Jasmine sat in her office, watching the endless stream of messages flooding her inbox. Some were from strangers, others from colleagues. Many were from ordinary Americans, teachers, construction workers, retirees, all saying the same thing. "You said what we've been thinking." But not everyone was congratulating her. The political establishment was already on the defensive. There were whispers in the halls of Congress, calls to downplay her actions, to minimize what had transpired. Jasmine knew they'd try to bury it, to turn it into just another flash in the pan. They'd try to dismiss her as a firebrand, an outlier, but they underestimated her. They underestimated the power of a person who wasn't willing to play by the old rules. As the days passed, the pressure from both sides mounted. The right-wing media tried to paint her as a radical, while some on the left questioned her approach. Was it too confrontational? Was it too risky? But Jasmine didn't care about the noise. She didn't care about being liked. She had a job to do, and she wouldn't let anyone distract her from that mission. Then, 3 days after the hearing, something unexpected happened. A bipartisan ethics bill, stalled for years, suddenly gained momentum. Senators from both parties were coming together to discuss measures aimed at holding the judiciary accountable. It wasn't just about Roberts anymore. It was about the entire system that had allowed corruption to thrive unchecked. And Jasmine had played a pivotal role in pushing that conversation forward. In one of her late-night meetings, she sat with her team, reading through the draft of the new ethics bill. As she scanned the text, a quiet sense of accomplishment settled in. She wasn't just shaking up the establishment. She was changing the way politics worked, one calculated move at a time. But even as the victory seemed imminent, Jasmine knew that this was only a small part of the bigger fight. The real change would come when more people, like her, stepped into the arena, refusing to play by the old rules, refusing to accept the status quo. The hearing had opened a door, but the battle to hold the powerful accountable was far from over. The next morning, as she prepared for a follow-up press conference, Jasmine stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her navy blue suit. The woman staring back at her was different now, not the hesitant newcomer, but a force, a voice that couldn't be ignored. She had made history, but she wasn't finished yet. The days after the hearing felt like a whirlwind. Jasmine barely had time to process the significance of what had just occurred before the world began to shift around her. The media was still buzzing with the aftermath, but as she sat alone in her office one evening, staring at the piles of reports and petitions on her desk, the weight of the moment truly began to sink in. She thought back to the days before she had walked into that hearing room, the questions that had haunted her, the doubts she had about whether one voice could really make a difference. But now, as she reflected on her journey, she knew the answer. It was always possible. It was always worth it. But what had she really accomplished? The ethics bill was a good start. She had shaken the foundations of the system. But was that enough? Jasmine wasn't naive. She knew the fight was long, and the hurdles would be many. The establishment wouldn't change overnight. But she also knew something else. People were watching, they were listening, and that was the first step. She received messages from young activists, law students, even corporate workers who had been inspired by her resolve. The hearings had ignited something in them, a spark that had been missing from their daily lives. They too were beginning to ask questions, to challenge the status quo, just as she had. Jasmine found herself in deep conversations with her team late into the nights. They talked about the challenges ahead, the roadblocks that awaited them in the political sphere. Every victory would come at a cost. There would be new opponents, new attacks, new hurdles to overcome. But there was something about the way they all spoke now, the certainty in their voices, the passion in their words, that told her they had changed too. On the outside, the political establishment was scrambling to regain control of the narrative. Pundits tried to twist her actions, painting her as a political opportunist. But no one could deny that Jasmine had forced them into an uncomfortable conversation, a conversation they had been avoiding for far too long. Jasmine knew that the next few weeks would be crucial. She couldn't let up now. This was only the beginning. And yet, in the quiet of the late hours, she allowed herself a rare moment of stillness. She closed her eyes, thinking of her parents, of their struggle, their sacrifices. She thought of the young people who were now looking up to her, the voices she had awakened. She had changed the conversation. But more than that, she had changed herself. No longer just a freshman congresswoman, she was now a leader, a symbol of what could happen when power was held accountable. And with that change came the responsibility to keep pushing, to keep questioning, to keep speaking the truth, even when the room was stacked against her. The momentum from the hearing hadn't died down, but it was clear that the hardest part of the battle was only just beginning. The bipartisan ethics bill was inching closer to passing, but Jasmine knew that the real challenge was ensuring the change wasn't just a symbolic gesture, a fleeting moment of progress that would soon fade into the background. She had to keep pushing. The world was watching, yes, but the world also had a tendency to forget. She sat in a small room in the Capitol building, her team gathered around a cluttered table covered with notes, documents, and phones. The discussions were now focused on how to keep the pressure up, how to build on the small wins without allowing the establishment to co-opt the narrative. The press was starting to turn its gaze elsewhere, and Jasmine couldn't let herself slip into the background. She wasn't going to be a one-hit wonder. She was in this for the long haul. The problem was, even within her own party, there were whispers of caution. Some argued that she had made too much noise too quickly, that her confrontational style could alienate potential allies. Jasmine heard them, but she didn't let their words cloud her vision. The system had been broken for too long, and sometimes you had to break the rules to fix it. The establishment had conditioned people to be polite, to play nice. But Jasmine knew that nice wasn't going to get things done. She wasn't here to win popularity contests. She was here to make a change. The question now was, where to go from here? Jasmine knew that tackling the ethics of the judiciary was just one piece of the puzzle. There were bigger, deeper issues at play. The influence of money in politics, the gridlock that stifled progress, the way the system seemed designed to protect the powerful and punish the vulnerable. She couldn't stop now. The wave she had created had to keep growing, but Jasmine was no fool. She knew that the more successful she became, the bigger the target on her back would grow. She was already getting calls from political rivals trying to gauge her next move. Some saw her as a threat, others saw her as an opportunity to manipulate. But Jasmine wasn't about to play their game. She was building something of her own, a movement, not a party line. She wasn't just pushing for policies. She was pushing for a new way of thinking. Late one evening, after a long day of meetings, Jasmine sat in her office, alone. Her eyes lingered on the photos of her parents on her desk, the people who had shaped her resolve, her belief in doing what was right, no matter the cost. They had never backed down from their struggles, and neither would she. A knock on the door broke her reverie. Her assistant walked in with a new report, numbers showing increased public support for the ethics bill, growing attention from activist groups, and a rising interest in her political career. Jasmine read through the figures, a small smile tugging at her lips. The change she had sparked was real, but it had only just begun. She stood up, looking out the window. The Capitol dome loomed in the distance, symbolizing the power she was slowly but surely claiming. But Jasmine knew that real power wasn't about sitting behind a desk. It was about showing up, again and again, no matter how many times the establishment tried to knock you down. She was ready for whatever came. Her next move wasn't just about politics. It was about reshaping the way the country thought about power, accountability, and what it meant to fight for justice. And she was more determined than ever to lead that fight. Months had passed since the hearing that had made Jasmine Crockett a household name. The hearings were over, the bill was inching its way toward a vote, and the political machine was beginning to grind forward again. But the seeds she had planted in that room had grown into something far larger than anyone had expected. Jasmine had become more than just a politician. She had become a symbol of the possibility of change. The public's response to her courage had reshaped the national conversation. People who had once felt invisible were now finding their voice, emboldened by the woman who had stood in the face of power and refused to back down. The movement had grown beyond ethics reform. It was about dismantling the systems that kept people marginalized, about challenging the idea that some voices were more important than others. But as her influence grew, so did the opposition. Political opponents had long been scheming, waiting for an opportunity to strike back. They had underestimated her before, but now they were determined to stop her. The whispers in the halls of Congress grew louder, and Jasmine knew what was coming. The coordinated attacks, the smear campaigns, the efforts to strip her of the very credibility she had earned. But Jasmine wasn't afraid. In fact, she was more resolute than ever. She knew the price of speaking truth to power, and she was prepared to pay it. The world had already seen what happened when a single voice refused to be silenced. The consequences of her actions had already begun to take shape. The ethics bill, which had seemed impossible just a few months ago, was now just one step away from becoming law. The hearings were a moment that would be remembered in history, but Jasmine knew that this was just the beginning of the real work. One evening, as she prepared for another long day of strategy meetings, she received an unexpected visitor. It was a reporter, someone from a major news outlet who had been following her journey since that unforgettable day in the hearing room. The reporter didn't waste time with pleasantries. Instead, she asked the question that had been on everyone's mind for weeks. "Do you regret how you've handled this?" the reporter asked, her voice calm but probing. Jasmine looked her in the eye. "Regret? No. I've been doing this because it's what's right, not because it's easy." She leaned forward, her voice steady. "The question is, when will everyone else start answering for their own failures?" The reporter paused, clearly taken aback by the boldness of the answer. But Jasmine wasn't done. "We've been told for too long that progress is slow, that change takes time. But I'm here to tell you, change is a choice. It's a decision we make every day. And I choose to keep fighting, for the people who have been left behind, for the voices that have been silenced, for the justice that has been denied. And I won't stop." As the reporter left, Jasmine stood in the quiet of her office, feeling the weight of the moment. She was no longer just a part of the system. She was changing it from within. And she knew that the battle wasn't over yet. In fact, it had only just begun. But one thing was certain. The world had seen what it meant to hold power accountable. And no matter what came next, Jasmine Crockett had proven that one person, armed with nothing but truth and determination, could change the course of history. When was the last time you saw someone speak truth to power so clearly? Drop your thoughts in the comments.